Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to episode 25 of It's Murder Up North. As always, thank you to everyone who has joined the Twitter and Facebook pages. If you love the podcast, please take a couple of minutes to leave a 5-star review wherever you listen. I would also like to thank my Patreon members for their continued support, and would like to welcome my newest patron, Kathy. Thank you for helping produce It's Murder Up North. My podcast of the week is Prash's Murder Map. His show delves into some of the most fascinating cases I have never heard of. And for a new podcast, he is doing an exceptional job.
Hey everyone, this is Prash, host of Prash's Murder Map. Pack your passport and jump on a plane, because I'd like to take you on a journey to investigate some of the most heinous, macabre and enigmatic murders across the globe and throughout history. We'll look at forensics, psychology and more as we dissect solved and unsolved cases like Australia's Frankston killer and a murderous family on the American frontier. If you'd like to give my podcast a try, you can find me on all major podcast platforms and YouTube. Hope to see you soon.
Now, let's head to the episode. The Hope Diamond was suspected to have been stolen from a Hindu temple in India, and over the preceding centuries it has changed hands on multiple occasions. Each person to possess it has reportedly been struck down by misfortune or death, beginning with the man who stole it, who it is speculated was ripped apart by dogs, leading people to believe that the diamond was cursed. The diamond has reportedly been in the possession of royalty, including King Louis XVI of France. The king and his queen, Marie Antoinette, were a symbol of the lavish and ostentatious lifestyles led by the aristocracy and the royal family, which had begun to stir up resentment in the poverty-stricken citizens of France, who were paying for the monarchy while struggling to afford to eat. This was one of the driving forces of the French Revolution. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were arrested and brought to Paris to face trial. While the former royals were now imprisoned, the abolition of the French monarchy was announced on the 21st of September 1792. Louis's trial began on the 3rd of December 1792. He was read the extensive lists of charges against him by Jean-Baptiste Milly. Quote, Louis, the French nation accuses you of having committed a multitude of crimes to establish your tyranny in destroying her freedom. Found guilty, the former king was executed via guillotine on the 21st of January 1793. Marie Antoinette was found guilty of depletion of the national treasury, conspiracy against the internal and external security of the state, and high treason. It was this final charge which led to her being executed on the 16th of October 1793. Having been witness to the excess of wealth and being present during the dying days of the nation's monarchy, the diamond passed on to a series of new owners until it came into the possession of Henry Thomas Hope, after whom the diamond was named. It then was passed down to his daughter Henrietta, who married a man called Henry Pelham Clinton, who would later become the Duke of Newcastle. Henrietta's youngest son, Henry Francis Pelham Clinton, then inherited it, with certain restrictions. Upon turning 18, he must take on the name Lord Francis Hope, and the diamond was only his until the time of his death, which meant he was not allowed to sell the diamond without gaining permission from a court of law. Like with the French monarchy, the excesses of wealth would soon take its toll on Lord Francis, He enjoyed spending money, gambling, and buying symbols of his great fortune. But he was in truth in severe financial difficulties. Unable to sell the diamond and having to declare himself bankrupt, he had to rely on his wife for financial support. By 1898, the financial burden was so dire that Lord Francis requested permission to sell the diamond, and following 2 refusals in 1901, he was allowed to sell it, and the jewel sold for £29,000, which is over £3 million today. Clumber Park in Nottinghamshire was once the ancestral home of Lord Francis and the seat of the Dukes of Newcastle. They possessed a 3,800-acre estate, which consisted of farms, woods, and extensive parkland, graced by a grand mansion, a deer park, a vast lake, and spectacular architectural structures. Once a wealthy and powerful family, over time, like many in the aristocracy, their fortunes waned. Despite selling many of the family possessions, including the Hope Diamond, the financial burden of owning a large mansion house became unmanageable. And with the intention of building a smaller property, the ancestral home was demolished in 1938. 82 years later, the plan to build another home never came to fruition, and by 1946, the estate was in the ownership of the National Trust, who maintain the park to this day. I don't know if I believe in the Hope Diamond curse, but it is clear to see that the fortunes of those who possess it do change. But was that the curse of the diamond, or the curse of money? Over 100 years after the Hope Diamond was sold by Lord Francis to save him from financial ruin, another family would come to live in the grounds of Clumber Park, and although they never possessed the diamond, greed and excessive spending would also be their downfall. Nigel Bacon, his wife Susan, and their 12-year-old son Tom lived in a 3-bedroom bungalow called Keeper's Cottage, set amongst the 4,000-acre Clumber Park estate. Nigel had owned and run a profitable security firm with the assistance of Susan, providing services to colleges and building sites throughout Nottinghamshire and beyond. Through the business, he had amassed a substantial fortune, which allowed him to live comfortably. In 2008, Nigel fell ill and was diagnosed with heart disease, which forced him to take a step back from running his business, passing the reins on to his wife and recently married 21-year-old son Michael. However, he continued to work as a gamekeeper on the Clumber Park estate, organising and running shooting events. November the 26th, 2008 was the night before the staff wages needed to be paid, so Nigel had brought the money home to prepare the wage packets, which was something he had routinely done every 2 weeks since the business had started. On that Wednesday, there was approximately £150,000 on the premises, as the family settled in the living room in front of the television. A man of habit, at 10 to 7, Nigel left the warmth of his home to traverse the long driveway to secure the gate. On his return, he would have a cigarette just outside the house. I wonder if he noticed that the house was suddenly in darkness. Did he see the figure stalking him? Did he hear the assailant's footsteps on the gravel? Or was he unaware of the man's presence until he felt the first blow of the knife? Whatever Nigel saw or felt, he struggled to get free of the attacker's blade. Stumbling to the front door, he crawled over the threshold and was able to force the door closed behind him. Susan heard her heavy-set husband struggling. She went to see what was happening. Nigel stood in the doorway to the room, gasping in pain. He told his wife he'd been stabbed. He took a few staggering steps before collapsing at Susan's feet. At first she joked with him to stop messing around, but then he repeated that he had been stabbed and told her to phone an ambulance. Susan grabbed the phone and dialed 999, telling the operator, quote, "There's blood everywhere. My husband went to shut the gates, and he went out through the door, and someone tried to stab him." The wife is heard comforting her husband, quote, all right, you're not going to die." While on the phone, the couple's son Michael arrived at the home. Seeing his dad wounded, he was struck down by shot and was unable to help. The family home was in a remote location, off the main roadway, surrounded by woodlands, and this made it difficult for paramedics to find the house. So Susan switched on the outside lights to help guide the ambulance to them. Paramedics found Nigel bleeding profusely on the tiled floor. On their arrival, his wife Susan sat herself down on a nearby chair and began smoking a cigarette, while her son stood beside her, his arms folded. 50-year-old father of 3 Nigel Bacon was taken to hospital, but was pronounced dead at 8:30 that night. A subsequent post-mortem found he had multiple defensive wounds on his arms, as well as 6 stab wounds to the neck and right shoulder, one of which had severed his jugular vein, which proved fatal. The pathologist stated that Nigel's pre-diagnosed heart disease also contributed to his death. Alan R. Moritz wrote in a paper on trauma and heart disease, "Injuries to any part of the body may and frequently do result in extra work for the heart. Such a sudden increase in work may cause a diseased heart to fail. It is not necessary that a wound be produced in order to cause extra workload for the heart. An episode of violent exertion, fear, pain, anger or anxiety may greatly increase the work of the heart independently of trauma." The police investigation began by looking into who would have caused to kill Nigel Bacon. But as they dug, they only widened their pool of suspects. It transpired that Nigel was an abrasive personality who had a habit of upsetting people, from former employees, family and friends. He was seen as a quick-tempered man who was prone to violent outbursts and wasn't well liked by many people for a variety of reasons. Speaking to his employees, they spoke of Nigel's volatile nature and how he was not a great boss to work for. Looking into the business, investigators also uncovered some serious discrepancies in how the security firm was managed. Reviewing the accounts, there were inaccuracies in the wages and questionable issues with paying taxes. This led to questions on how legitimate the business was and whether Nigel was involved in illegal activities. While this line of inquiries was checked, his wife and son were questioned. Susan described the night as it happened, the grieving wife desperately trying to make sense of her husband's death. When asked who could have had a motive to murder her husband, she had one name: their eldest son, Stuart. 33-year-old Stuart Bacon hung up the phone in disbelief as a mass of emotions rushed over him. He had just been notified that his father had died, a man he hadn't spoken to in 14 years. Speaking to Stuart, the investigators got a clearer picture of who Nigel Bacon was. Stuart was born in April 1980. The family originally lived in Mansfield, near Sheffield. He recalls how Susan was a loving mother and he adored his dad. As he got older, he became aware of his dad's more violent side. Stuart admitted that Nigel had a temper and would beat his mother. He recalled seeing his mum being physically assaulted on many occasions, and the terrified boy would cower in his room as he heard their vicious rows, after which his mum, battered and bleeding, would go to the bathroom, clean herself up, then would sit in his bed and cradle him. On occasions where Stuart did something that would have angered Nigel, Susan would protect her son by taking the blame and subsequent beating. Michael's arrival in 1988 made home life worse for Stuart. His once loving mother changed her attitude towards her eldest son. She became cold and neglectful. As children get older, their understanding of the world develops, and they start to notice things. For Stuart, he started to see that his father's anger was not spontaneous and unpredictable. Susan knew how to get a reaction out of her husband, and when his dad started beating him, Stuart's eyes were open to the manipulative way in which his mother goaded Nigel into hurting her child. Stuart remembered when he was alone with his dad, he was a different person. He was the doting father he once knew. While Michael was doted on and protected, Stuart's abuse escalated. It started with him being locked in his bedroom for hours, with no food or drink and a bucket to urinate in. At night, he was made to sleep in the coal shed in the backyard. The police were notified of a possible case of child abuse when Stuart started turning up to school with multiple bruises. However, following a brief investigation and a chat with his parents, who were able to convince the police that their eldest son was a troublemaker who regularly got into fights and was unmanageable, the police decided no further action was needed following this claim. For Stuart, the police involvement only made his situation worse. His parents chained him up and kept him prisoner in his room. They repeatedly tortured him and tied a noose around his neck in an attempt to hang him. The parents seemed to get a thrill from inflicting harm on the 14-year-old. While in the privacy of their home, Nigel and Susan were violent and abusive. Yet to the community they were well respected. This changed when their secret was revealed. On one occasion, Nigel and Susan had taken Stuart out. The trio came across a car and Nigel insisted that his 15-year-old son set fire to it. Despite knowing the consequences of disobeying his father, Stuart refused. Nigel flew into a rage and began to strike the teenager, punching the boy, and then, when Stuart was on the ground, he started to kick him relentlessly, while Susan stood by and started to berate and insult her son with vile names. They marched Stuart back home, wounded, bleeding and swollen, and locked him in his room. Unbeknownst to the parents, the savage assault had been witnessed. Police forced entry into the family home and arrested Susan and Nigel while they were still in bed. As the pair awaited trial, Stuart was taken into care. Nigel was found guilty of mistreating a young person under 16 and received an 18-month prison sentence, while Susan was handed a 15-month suspended sentence. Stuart was finally free of his parents' cruelty. He moved away, started his own family, and tried to get on with his life. So when he learned of his father's death, he was torn. There were so many things that had gone unresolved, questions left unanswered, and an estranged relationship that would never be rebuilt. But was Stuart responsible for Nigel Bacon's death? The years of abuse at his father's hand made it plausible. But why, after 14 years, would Stuart suddenly decide to end his abuser's life? Police were able to corroborate Stuart's story. They were also able to prove that he was nowhere near Clumber Park at the time of the murder. And so, despite Susan's suspicions, Stuart was eliminated from the inquiry. The list of potential suspects was dwindling. Police had ruled out disgruntled employees and associates. Investigators considered if it was a burglary gone wrong. After all, there was £150,000 on the premises that night. They hoped evidence found at the scene would help bring Nigel Bacon's killer to justice. In the daylight, it was evident that the attack had been savage and swift. Blood patterns on the drive showed where the attack occurred. As Nigel tried to get back to the house, he lost his slippers. A blood pool near the door showed that Nigel had collapsed and had started dragging himself towards the house. The final knife blow came as he crawled over the threshold. As Nigel dragged himself into the house, the killer continued to stab him. A muddy footprint was found on the lower panel of the door, possibly from the killer attempting to stop the wounded man from shutting it on him. The assault was thought to have been so violent that the perpetrator had lost his balaclava, which was found a few metres away from the doormat. This piece of evidence was taken for DNA testing, along with a scarf and glove that had been found on a footpath which linked the crime scene to a road. With the evidence gathered and a clearer picture of what had occurred, they also believed that the rural location suggested the assailant may have driven to the scene. It was at this stage that a public appeal for information was made. From the appeal, they got a strong lead. On the day of the murder, a cyclist had seen a car in a lay-by on a quiet country road. The cyclist was able to provide a detailed description of the vehicle and the exact location they saw it. The car had been parked on the road end of the footpath that led directly to the Bacon family's bungalow. What was more significant was that this same car, or one just like it, had been abandoned and set on fire. When the owner of the car was traced, it was found to belong to a local factory worker, Peter Jakes. A search of the burnt-out car revealed a knife in the boot, which was a close match to the one used in the attack. Police were also able to conclusively match Jakes' shoe impressions to the muddy footprint found on the door. Although this evidence placed him near the scene, this was not strong enough to charge the man with murder. However, the DNA database would provide that crucial link. 2 DNA profiles had been retrieved from the balaclava. One was found to be Nigel's, and the other was Peter Jakes. He had been arrested previously for a minor driving offence, and because of this, his genetic profile had been added to the national database. When questioned, Peter claimed he had planned to burgle the house that night, but was surprised by Nigel and in a panic stabbed him. He went on to protest that he did not plan to kill the 50-year-old. On the surface, this appeared to be a clear-cut case. Peter Jakes was in serious debt, and it was well known that Nigel Bacon had a habit of keeping large sums of money in the house. So it was possible he had planned to steal the money to pay off his mounting debt. Analysing his phone records, they were also able to place Jakes at the scene. However, the phone records disclosed something even more intriguing. Susan and Michael Bacon had denied knowing anyone by the name of Peter Jakes, and there was no obvious connection between them. The phone record showed a call placed to Michael Bacon moments after Nigel had been attacked. Up to this point, the family had not been under any suspicion, but this phone call changed everything. A subsequent search of the Bacon's home yielded more clues, which would implicate more people in the plot to murder Nigel. Inside the house, police found detailed notes laying out the version of events the family would tell the police after the attack. It also appeared that a plan was made to leave the country, and that research had been carried out into which countries have extradition treaties with the UK. These plans had identified Tunisia as a potential destination. One detail the investigators found odd was on a report from the alarm company, which stated that the power to the property's alarm had gone off moments before the attack, and was restored at roughly 7:10, just before the paramedics had arrived. An explanation for this power outage was soon discovered. It transpired that the alarm and the outside lights shared the same fuse. In their reports, the paramedics noted that they couldn't find the property until the exterior lights were switched on, leading to the conclusion that someone in the house had used the fuse box to extinguish the lights. Only 12-year-old Tom and his mum Susan were in the home when the attack occurred. Was Susan complicit in the murder of her husband? Had she assisted the attacker by plunging the driveway into darkness? Despite hours of questioning, the widow maintained her innocence. However, the police were provided some very damning evidence against the grieving wife. After the police had made the public appeal, a tip came in from a man called Barry Squires. He told officers that Susan had approached him in September 2008. She wanted to make it look like her husband had died in an accident, and she asked Barry if he could make that happen. She offered to pay him £4,000 and an allowance of £400 a week for the rest of his life. He refused to help her, as did a couple of other men whom she had asked to help get rid of her abusive husband. It was 3 weeks after Nigel Bacon was killed that Susan, Michael and Peter were charged with murder. While in custody awaiting trial, Michael wrote to his wife Natasha and each letter not only strengthened the case against the defendants, but also led police to 2 more co-conspirators. Natasha had been asking people to provide Michael with an alibi, and in another exchange, Michael voices his concerns about how long DNA can remain on certain surfaces. Natasha was also trying to get someone to confirm the contact telephone number that was listed on Michael's phone was indeed a man called Ricky Marsh, who was interested in a job. However, police had already confirmed that the number belonged to Peter Jakes and were unable to find anyone by the name of Ricky Marsh. Through Natasha, investigators also found the connection between the Bacons and Jakes. It turned out that Natasha's dad, Sean Woodcock, was an acquaintance of Jakes, and he had put his son-in-law in touch with him. With Sean Woodcock, a further piece of the puzzle fell into place. Investigators have been unable to trace a number that Peter had called twice on the day of the murder. During a search of Woodcock's home, a mobile phone was discovered under the decking, and this phone was linked to Susan. Although he had been estranged from his family for 14 years, Nigel's eldest son Stuart visited his mother and brother in prison before the trial. Michael had endured the same abuse as his older brother, and he had clearly been manipulated by his mother. During his visit, Stuart realised how angry Michael was at their father, particularly because Nigel had written him out of his will. Stuart expressed his feelings about his 21-year-old brother, quote, "I love my brother, and he's still that little boy that I left behind. I know he's a grown man, and I know he's done these terrible things, but I find it hard to accept some of what he's done. Just because he's my brother and I know what my mum is like. But I don't think I can forgive him, because it's still murder." His visit with his mother had a profound effect on Stuart. He said, quote, "I was expecting to find a woman in bits, and she wasn't. She was still the same cocky, arrogant woman that didn't care about anyone but herself. She was trying to make out to me that Michael was the murderer." Following these visits, he reflected, quote, "I'd spent years longing for my family, and I'm sat there on this visit, and I'm thinking, thank God you're not near my kids. Thank God they are there and you are in here, 'cause, wow, look what you've done to my brother." The trial commenced in December 2009 at Nottingham Crown Court. The 3 defendants, Susan Bacon, her son Michael, and their accomplice, Peter Jakes, were all tried together. The court heard that Nigel Bacon had an estate worth £350,000, but unbeknownst to him, Susan had accrued debts of over £60,000, including a substantial amount which she owed to the Inland Revenue. His son Michael was in a similar position, newlywed, jobless, and debt-ridden. Michael had reputedly approached his dad asking for a loan, but Nigel had refused to help his son. Michael also had a deep-seated resentment for his father. After suffering years of abuse, being made to feel he wasn't good enough in his dad's eyes, the final blow came when Michael wanted to take over the security firm. However, Nigel rejected the idea shortly after Michael got married. Not only did he reject it, but he took steps to ensure his son wouldn't inherit the firm either. Stuart Bacon stated, quote, "My mum spent years promising Michael that if you put up with this, and you do this and that for me, and this business will be yours, I promise you." Well, my mum couldn't keep that promise, as my dad had stuck his heels in and said no way. When my dad was like that, he meant it. There was going to be no way of changing his mind. The prosecutor, Peter Joyce QC, presented the idea that the motive for the murder was driven by the want of money. He said, quote, Mrs. Bacon was in dire straits, while her husband was wealthy. The Bacons tried unsuccessfully to hire other individuals as killers before settling on Mr. Jakes, who was himself thought to have accrued more than £123,000 worth of debt. The sums were so high that in August 2008 he barricaded himself in his home against bailiffs. The court heard how in 2008 Nigel had been forced to retire from the security company he had owned and managed for 12 years, due to him being diagnosed with heart disease, with symptoms which can include chest pains, swelling, pain or numbness in the limbs, breathlessness, irregular heartbeat or palpitations, feeling lightheaded or fatigued. Sufferers may require medication, a pacemaker or surgery, and are advised to make changes to their lifestyle, including stopping smoking and limiting their exposure to stressful situations. It is possible that to reduce his stress, he chose to hand over the day-to-day running of the business to his wife and son. When Nigel refused to relinquish full control of the business to his son, Susan promised Michael that he would get the company, and she would find a way to make it happen. It was suggested that the pair's plans to kill Nigel started in 2008, after Michael had gotten married and had been disinherited by his father. Susan was portrayed as the mastermind behind the plan and manipulated others to be complicit, either by claiming that she was an abused wife or offering financial incentives to those who would help her. It was revealed that she had approached a number of people at the security firm to carry out the attack, telling one of them about the remote location of the Bacon house and informing him of her husband's poor health. It amazes me that despite these people being asked to kill her husband, none of them went to the police with their concerns. Perhaps they didn't think Susan was serious. The question is, would you have gone to the police if you were in their situation? There was also suggestions that she was determined to ensure Mike was dead by Christmas of 2008. I have not found why this conclusion was drawn, but perhaps it was due to her extensive debts and she needed the money by the end of the year. When Susan had exhausted all her contacts, Michael spoke to his father-in-law, Sean Woodcock, who apparently suggested Peter Jakes. With Jakes having debts in excess of £120,000, it was implied that he accepted the job for the financial reward on offer. It transpired that on November the 25th, 2008, the day before the murder, Jakes and Michael Bacon met in the car park of the Clumber Park Hotel, where an upfront payment of £2,000 was made. Following this cash exchange, CCTV footage shows the amateur hitman in a local supermarket, where receipts from his purchase showed he had bought the dark clothing, 3 knives and a balaclava. On the day of the murder, it is alleged that Jakes drove to the lay-by near to the Bacon's home. Using the footpath across the field to get to the bungalow, he knew that Nigel would exit the property in order to lock the gates. And so, Jakes lay in wait until Susan switched off the external lights, at which point, under the cover of darkness, Jakes violently attacked Nigel, only stopping when the 50-year-old was able to close the door on him. During the attack, Jakes lost his balaclava, which was found near the mat, and as he ran across the field to his car, he shed other items of clothing, which were later found to have his and Nigel Bacon's DNA on it. He placed a phone call to Michael Bacon to confirm he had carried out the attack. Jakes then got in his car, drove away and later dumped the vehicle and set fire to it, hoping that it would destroy the evidence he had left behind. After considering the evidence, the jury found Michael, Susan and Jakes guilty of the murder of Nigel Bacon. On the 18th of December 2009, the judge, Mr. Justice Sweeney, passed sentence. Sentencing Peter Jakes to a minimum term of 28 years, he stated, quote, You were ultimately recruited by Nigel Bacon, who showed you the general area around Keeper's Cottage, agreed terms with you, and paid you around £2,000 cash in advance. You used part of that cash to purchase the dark clothing and the carving knife that was used to carry out the murder. Susan Bacon was handed a minimum term of 24 years. The judge stated that, quote, she was the instigator of the joint enterprise to murder her husband and the driving force behind it. When the attempt to solicit Martin Grant was going nowhere, you recruited your son Michael to persuade him again. When that failed, Michael, with your constant encouragement, tried to find someone else, using the initial guise that violence was required to sort out a neighbour dispute. Mr. Justice Sweeney described Michael as his mother's creature, suggesting that he had been coerced into helping her kill his father. Michael Bacon was given a minimum term of 21 years for his involvement in the calculated murder of his father. In his closing statement, the judge addressed the three prisoners, quote, Peter Jakes, Susan Bacon and Michael Bacon, you have each been convicted on overwhelming evidence of the brutal murder of Nigel Bacon, aged 50, on the evening of November the 26th of last year. The cold-blooded contract killing of the man who was your husband, Susan Bacon, and your father, Michael Bacon, albeit that there was a number of amateur features in how it was all carried out. In regards to the co-conspirators, Sean Woodcock, Michael's father-in-law, was acquitted of all charges. Michael's wife, Natasha, whom he had corresponded with while awaiting trial, and who had been trying to arrange alibis for her husband, pleaded guilty to perverting the course of justice, and was ordered to do 200 hours unpaid work. This is a case that has so many layers. Susan and Nigel were both abusive parents. Their children grew up in an environment of fear, being emotionally and physically abused. Nigel has been described as violent and controlling, while Susan was manipulative and calculating. She knew how to provoke Nigel, what buttons to press to get him into a rage. The abusive nature of this relationship formed an environment of anger and resentment. As a couple, Nigel and Susan were a dangerous mix. It is not known if Nigel knew about his wife's dire financial situation, but what is known was that her solution to her money problems was to have her husband killed. I always try to be the voice for the victim. In this case, the victims were the couple's three sons. Tom, who was just 12 years old when his father was murdered. Michael, who, after years of abuse from both parents, was manipulated into helping kill his father. Finally, there's Stuart. He suffered horrific physical and psychological abuse from his mother and father, the two people who were supposed to love and protect him. Speaking of his mother, Stuart stated, quote, I'll always love her because she's my mum, but I hate her, and that will never change. In regards to his father's death, Stuart stated, quote, my dad didn't deserve that. I walked away from everything I knew and loved. If I could do that as a child and lose everything, why can't a grown woman do that? He continued, it made me think of all the time lost, and that maybe I should have gone and found him and tried to talk, even if he still didn't want to listen, even if he was still the same man he was. I should have made more of an effort, and I wouldn't feel as empty as I do now. His family tore itself apart, and Stuart recalled, quote, when the police phoned me up and told me what happened, I didn't know what to think. I knew my family was strange and everything, and that we were different, and obviously I was part of that family at one point. I didn't think it would go that far. Stuart walked away from his tumultuous home life, and he started a family of his own, determined not to repeat his past. However, there is one aspect of his past that he will cherish. When Nigel met Susan, he was married to his first wife and had 2 daughters, Kerry and Lindsay. However, he denied they were his and did not acknowledge their existence. It was only following his death and a subsequent DNA test that the truth that had long been denied was revealed. Stuart may have lost one family, but he now has 2 half-sisters and a family of his own. Thank you so much for joining me for episode 25 of It's Murder Up North. Episode 26 will be available on Sunday.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.